All right, we are rolling. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fabulous webinar with Prevalent. And this one is really dedicated to the CMMC. We're going to be talking about third-party risk management program considerations, and we have a special guest. His name is Jeff Dalton. And who he is, you wonder? Well, he is from CMMC, Accreditation Body. It's a very fancy title, and we shortened it. It was about 3 paragraphs long. And in addition, of course, our lovely Brenda Ferraro is with us, our VP of Third-Party Risk. My name's Amanda. I am your host. I'm also the business development rep here at Prevalent. And just so you all know, my background will change because I have a cleaning person coming and I got to just like hide around the room while we go over this webinar. So sorry about that. But a couple of things to go over. So everyone is muted already, so we don't hear anything going on, but I deeply encourage you all to participate, make this lively, do the Q&A in the Zoom console on the bottom there, and we will ask all those questions towards the end of the session, and we will also have a poll question at the end as well. And if you have to walk away from the computer or you don't make this, we will send you a recording tomorrow morning. It'll be in your inbox. Check your spam. Sometimes we fall in there. And that's that. So we are ready to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. I can see why they have you open all webinars. Lots of energy for giving people a happy day. And thank you for doing that. And thank you, Brenda. Great to have you on today's webinar with me. It's always better with two people, I think. So feel free to interact as much as you'd like. But I am going to give you all an overview of what CMMC is all about, where we are in the process. A lot of people are asking this question. A lot of people are excited about CMMC and impatient, and lots of news coming out of the government about the interim rule, and there's just lots of movement. A lot of times people ask me, you know, what's the best thing about CMMC? Like, why is this so great? Why is this such a big deal? And there's a lot of different opinions out there, a lot of different thoughts, and I could probably come up with 10 things. But the main thing for me is that everybody's talking about cybersecurity now. Everybody. Where 2 years ago, you know, some CISOs were out there saying, you know, red flag, pay attention. But this year, boy, everybody's talking about it. You know, everybody from the Department of Defense with Katie Arrington, who's doing a great job informing everybody, and really, I think she does a webinar every day or a conference every day, and she's really done a great job getting the information out to people. And we've been doing, I think I've done over 100 webinars this year about CMMC, and everybody's talking about it. And that's great that everybody's talking about cybersecurity, because, you know, the average person in the country thinks about cybersecurity, and they think about breaches at Target, and they think about breaches in their credit card. And right now there's a pretty big breach going on with charitable giving organizations. And those things are super important and need to be corrected. But there's also breaches happening within the Defense Department and within the federal government. And these are deadly serious issues to deal with, because people that might be our adversaries are indeed benefiting from intellectual property and information that becomes available to them when there is a breach. And I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So to me, the really most important thing about CMMC is that we're all talking about cybersecurity, because in the end, cybersecurity is possible when people do things. Technology is important. Automation is important, and all those things are important, but the most important thing is the actions people take, because many times the cause of a breach is caused by a person or an organization, not by a piece of technology. So, and even if it is technology, it was scripted or installed in a way that was done by a person and caused that problem. So everybody has to start thinking about people and processes and why these things are important to us. And that's what's great about CMMC. So a couple of things about this model are different than anything we've seen before in this part of the business. Now, all of us are probably familiar with ISO 9001, ISO 27001. They're probably familiar with CMMI and ITIL and some of these other assessor-led models. And in some ways, the CMMC program bears some resemblance to that. It's a third-party independent assessment model where organizations are going to be licensed to deliver assessment services and report assessment results to the Department of Defense and maybe someday other agencies. And this is probably the biggest and fastest rollout of a program of its kind in the history of our nation or any nation. ISO 9001, ISO 27001 took years and years, if not decades, to roll out to the kind of numbers that we're predicting for CMMC. The assessment method and assessment guides and model definition were created in record time. And this was as a result of an emergency really in our country's security that we really needed something to reinforce and harden our cybersecurity or organizational approach to cybersecurity. So you're probably familiar with an interim rule that came out. It'll be actually law in December. It is going to start the process of conducting these assessments, and they're going to roll it out a little bit at a time. So there's a lot of rumors going around when you're going to have to be CMMC certified. We're just going to start in December and slowly roll out so that by 2026, all DoD contractors. Brenda, what are you all thinking at your company about CMMC and preparedness for that?
So as a strategic resource, the things that I think about, since I was a former CISO and I did build a third-party risk program that had a lot of third parties that I needed to assess, what I like about CMMC is that they are standardizing exactly what's required for the DoD. And they're taking an evolutionary approach that's going to give us the time to grow all the way to 2026. And they've looked at the information that's required for different levels of companies that are doing business so that when you partner with someone, you have the ability to plan for any of those gotchas or vulnerabilities. So I think what's really great about CMMC is that from our perspective at Prevalent, we're trying to enable not only the companies that have to prepare and get ready for accreditation and certification, but also helping those that are doing the support services of doing the testing protocols, making sure that they have those security items in place, and then reporting out what those items are so that they can stay through the certification 3-year time period. And I'm sure you're going to be talking about much of that as well. So I'm really excited about taking that spreadsheet approach and providing some automation techniques where available, knowing that process always comes before technology. So I'm glad that you're talking about a key point in process, and then we're going to be helping the people with all the workflow that could happen with every level throughout the timeline from now until 2026 and furthermore.
Perfect. That's great. So I think you kind of referred to this, Brenda, but why did we need the CMMC to begin with? We had NIST 800-171. We had all kinds of different certifications and programs. And really, it had to do with the standardization of what the definition of secure was. And we can debate, I think honest people can easily debate whether this first version of the CMMC model is the last version. I think I would argue it definitely isn't, and that there will be improvements, but we needed some way to standardize on the definition of good, right? Mm-hmm. You've probably seen this as a CISO, like what is the definition of goodness or mature when it comes to a cybersecurity program in your company?
Yeah, I think that what I always focused on is that the maturity is an evolutionary approach. You've got to start somewhere. And so what CMMC has done so far is made a really good starting point.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about maturity and capability in a second. One of the things Katie Arrington always talks about is this example of the F-35, where not long after we flew the first F-35, China just happened to have one that was very similar. And I don't know all the inside details of that program, but a breach was afoot in this. And, the CMMC was really the result of people saying, we need to really get our arms around this. And, is it better than other models? Well, I don't know. I don't know. Time will tell, but it will be better than other models as it matures and as it gets better. I think we're at version 1.02 now. I started my journey in process management and as an assessor. I've been an assessor for 25 years in the CMMI space. And I remember when version 1 came out of that. And we had a lot of the same conversations that you're seeing now. Oh, it's not perfect. There's problems with it. There's disconnects. Who wrote this thing? That kind of stuff. But now that we're, I think, 4 versions into it, 20 years later, it's really mature and it's really improved. And I think the evolution of a model itself, models like this have their own maturity scales, right? And CMMC is just coming out. The good news is it was built upon a proven framework. I mean, it was really built upon this proven maturity model framework. And CMMC is both a capability model and a maturity model, meaning that as you move up in the levels, you move up in capabilities, you add new functionality into the model, new capabilities. But also there's a maturity requirement that as you move up in the model, you have different levels of institutionalization. Sometimes we call this persistent and habitual behaviors that help drive the behavioral piece of this. Make sure people are properly trained, make sure things are properly documented, make sure things are being measured, and so on and so forth. So it's both a maturity model and a capability model that'll be used by assessors in the field to assess the various organizations that are interested in certification.
I like how you talked about the culture change. I usually call that adaptive enablement. So it's just another way to say what you just said in a different words, but you have to make sure that the culture and all of the components are growing along with the readiness of your company on being able to perform those duties.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you were to take this into a completely different setting and say, what does level 1 look like? Well, level 1 looks like an organization that is working hard to do their best. Each individual is taking responsibility for things. There isn't necessarily an organizational approach to doing it. There's really no way of verifying what things are doing, but at least people are trying to do the right things. That's a fairly typical definition of level 1. Level 2, we start looking at, what's the definition of these actions? Like, what's the agreed upon definition? And, sometimes people say, well, we just hire really smart people and they know what to do and they do what's right. But that's really difficult to scale that sort of behavior. And so coming to an agreement on, what is the expected behavior or the expected action for this particular control or this particular practice, exactly when are our doors going to be locked and exactly who has to sign in and exactly when do they have to change their passwords. All of these things are policy questions that we see in level 2 as people start to coalesce around standards. So I've been watching these documentaries lately. I just had a sudden urge to learn about the evolution of humans. I don't know why. I just woke up one day and said, I knew about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and all that, but turns out there's dozens and dozens of different, stages along the way that I wasn't really practiced at. And it is a little bit like that. I mean, you get to level 2, people are starting to coalesce around the fire. They're starting to say, hey, let's do things together. Let's standardize a little bit. When we get to level 3, we're starting to look at how this organization is performing and proactively working according to a plan, right? Working according to the expected definition of that behavior we expect to see. And when we get to level 4, we're kind of reviewing that to make sure that things are actually happening from an organizational level, maybe measuring it. And then in level 5, we're using data to continuously improve how we work. So if you kind of like think about the evolution of any being at all, that's exactly how it works. And that's what it's based on. So the CMMC is no different. So it's both capability, where at each level there's new controls and new practices. And at each level we see more organization, more process, more management of how the work gets done until we get to the point where we're continuously improving.
Yeah, and I when I got certified from Dr. Michael Hammer on process mastery from Harvard and MIT, we really talked about you cannot manage what you do not measure. And when you start with putting together the information at the very get-go, good is good enough. But then when you start documenting it and others are also following those protocols, then you can start putting your performance indicators and your risk indicators that will help you into the measurement phase so that you can tweak the program and then finally get into that optimizing where you're in that consistent plan, do, check, act phase. So when I was at a healthcare company and I ran incident response, this was really important because in order to do incident response scenario-based tests and to know what was going to happen in the supply chain or happen based on who we were working with, if we didn't have these things documented for an evolutionary approach to make things better, this is exactly what's helping to make CMMC and that control organization and all of the components and people work together so that you know exactly where you might have a hiccup or you might have a vulnerability that needs to be addressed and where to pivot most naturally. So it's fun to see how CMMI and COVID and ITIL and everything's starting to come together for the DoD.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you mentioned plan, do, check, act. So if you were to apply Deming's rules to a maturity model, it kind of flips them a little bit. It's do, plan and do, and then plan, do, and check, and then plan, do, check, and act.
Yep.
So level one's like do, right? Level two's
do.
Plan and do. Yeah, right. Level one's just doing it. And so that's the maturity component. But there isn't that requirement to have things written down and plans and documents and all those things in level one, but there are 17 controls. Yeah,
that comes later when you know exactly what you need to document up. Yeah,
that's right. And it's really interesting to me. I'm kind of a methodology theorist. I guess I would call myself a hobbyist on this more than anything. I've written a couple of books about it, but if you look at the Agile community and software development, that's exactly how they operate. The first iteration through something is all experimental and all trying new things. And they may even go through multiple increments like that. And then they finally, coalesce around certain behaviors. So they're kind of level two then. And then they start doing their, really changing the way they're working with retrospective. So regardless of the industry you look at, this model really holds. And I think sometimes people have a little bit of trouble sort of conceptualizing it outside of this, but it really does hold in every industry, this idea of maturity and capability. So I think they were right on when the DoD picked this framework as kind of an approach. I think they were right on because it's proven and it just works. And we just have to get people to kind of get their arms around it.
Yeah, I would agree. It's industry agnostic in standards. So good job.
Yeah, they did the folks at the SCI as a contractor to the DoD. Of course, they're the same organization that created the CMMI, and they've repurposed that model for risk management, for smart grid management, for people management. They've really repurposed that model for many different things, and now they've repurposed it for cyber. But it's important to kind of look at the two sides of this. So the CMMC model has practices in it, sometimes called controls because of NIST 800-171. And this is the capability part. This is where each level has additional practices that to implement. And none of it's foreign to any kind of CISO. I mean, you all know what's in here. Most of this actually mirrors what's in NIST 800-171 and ISO 1721. On the left-hand side, they're calling the processes. So they've differentiated, technically they've differentiated the model from practices to processes. And this is the people process side of it, right? So they use the word perform to mean just do it, like we were saying before. They use the word documented to describe that, whatever actions people take, there's a definition of what they are. They use the word managed to describe executing something in accordance to a plan. Reviewed, obviously management and other parts of the organization are looking at the results and optimizing as that continuous improvement. Now, I just want to sort of set the baseline on the expectation on this from the DoD has been that they're not trying to mirror or emulate something like CMMI here, which has, as you probably know, has very robust process management, very robust practice. They have a whole entire area, at least 4 of them that are dedicated to this topic. And the DoD was careful to learn a lesson from that maybe that, and I'm a CMMI appraiser, so I'm a believer, but the DoD has taken care to just sort of turn that volume knob down a tiny bit, especially early on, and say, okay, well, you need to improve and you need to be mature, but we're not going to quite go to that level of rigor like that CMMI goes to.
Yeah, I worked at Edwards Air Force Base in logistics material control support, and also at Luke Air Force Base. And they do have a different technique in the military and in the government to make sure that you keep it simple, don't get too comprehensive, and be very direct. And so I think that this is definitely gearing into that direction to really pinpoint everything that you need to focus on versus all the fluff that might be in the perimeters.
Yeah, and I think they've done a good job. And one thing that comes up a lot that maybe I can dispel a myth really just simply is people look at some of the requirements in this model and they look at the practices and they say, oh, I need every practice documented, or I need a policy for every practice, which of course is 181 practices. So that would be pretty burdensome. Right. So the answer really is it's about your processes, right? And you need policies about your processes. Your process for protecting something probably does include many practices. So you got to get your arms around, how do you do the work and how do you expect people to do the work, and then have policies around that, as opposed to reverse engineering the model and building a bunch of policies and practices around the practices in the model. And you're already starting to see on the internet, people saying, I've got your templates here, I've got your process, your policies here, come buy my policy kit and you can be CMMC in 30 days or less. And that's, that happens in every industry, but really it's about change and about behaviors as much as it's about technology. So, a packet of templates might be helpful in some cases, but it certainly isn't going to be the answer to the problem.
Yeah, I really think that they're going to be looking, or when you're doing your accreditation, you'll probably get into this, is looking to say, like we said, just do it. Either you have it or you don't. And then next is, how well are you doing it? And is it documented, and is it governed? And then are you improving it as you find things that are needing to be fixed? So domains. What we got here?
Yeah, it is. Well, this is kind of the list, right? This is like everything that gets checked across the model in all levels. So this includes everything. Now, there's a smaller number in level 1, and then there's more in level 2 and more in level 3 until you get to level 5 and includes everything. But I'm not going to dig into these individually. A lot of these things are things you and your viewers are probably familiar with. But I wanted to make a comment about context. The reason that this is called an assessment and not an audit is that how a company implements something is contextually driven by things like their size, their complexity, the kind of business they're in, the level of sophistication of the team, the technology they use. There's an unlimited number of factors to drive context. And so when you're assessing an organization, like you said, it's not only are you doing it or you're not doing it, but how are you doing it? And then how well are you? Right. And so the effectiveness of it, how well are you doing it? And is what you're doing in the context of your size, your business type, et cetera, is it appropriate or not? You could take an example like a far out example would be if you have a 30,000 person company, does sending an email count for setting a policy? I would say probably not, right? But in a two-person company, it probably does, right? So if it's an audit, it's a yes or a no, and there's like no room for contextualization. Well, the method has no room for contextualization, although the auditors insert contextualization in it in an uncontrolled
Depending on
way.
if you're like an AICPA firm or not, correct? You'll have opinions plus techniques to fix. Yeah.
Right. And the problem with that is that it's not scalable. If you got an audit methodology that's just a yes or no checkbox, but you have auditors kind of freewheeling their interpretation of things and marking yes or no based on their interpretation, when the method isn't really designed for that, you tend to have a lot of chaos, where an assessment methodology has the assessor evaluate the context before they even step foot in the organization and come up with, using the assessment guide and other things, a picture of what they're expecting to see in that context. And so each of these is subject to contextual interpretation, which is what makes assessments so difficult. Some people might say, oh, that makes it subjective, and an audit's not subjective. And I would argue that audits are very subjective. They're just not controlled. The auditor treats things subjectively, but doesn't report that he or she did that. So it becomes a very different kind of outcome. So, each of these is subject to, things like size and complexity, and have to be by definition. So they're all, sometimes there's a right answer. Either you have a lock on the door or you don't. And sometimes things like, is this thing mature, or is this policy good, or does this frequency of password change, is it effective or not? Those things are subject to contextual interpretation.
Agreed.
Makes it more difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that as well. Even if not talking about CMMC and looking at assessments in general, we have the ability to take information and configure it into the solution so that if you have a specific scope in mind, then those different risks and recommendations for the risks would apply, so you'd have one voice. So I'm hoping that when people start looking to plan and prepare for their accreditation and their certification, they're looking at solutions that can help them with getting that information in the context that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting because people are, getting a little bit nervous about CMMC, of course, because they're going to be subject to it, and everybody, when they're asked to be subject to something like that, tends to get a little bit nervous. And the most questions I get have to do with this maturity question, like what does this mean? So one thing to remember here is that, if you assess a company at level 1, you're assessing them at level 1 processes too, meaning they need to be performed, which is the just do it level, right?
Right.
If I assess a company in level 3, I need to assess that company in the context of this word managed, which means establish, maintain, and resource a plan that includes whatever the domains that are in scope. But I also need to recursively do that with level 1, because remember, we have capability and maturity. So those capabilities, or otherwise known as practices in level 1, are also subject to the managed clause, right? So you just have to be a little bit careful when you're thinking through this, that if you're going for level 3, if that's your requirement, then everything that's in scope needs to adhere to this managed requirement, the processes they're calling them, which means that not only do they have to just do it, they have to plan it, and they have to document it. Now we're talking through what some examples of those might be, but it's a recursive model like that. And if your company handles CUI, then it's a given that you're going to be level 3. But if you don't handle CUI, there's not necessarily a requirement to go to level 3. We feel most of the companies are going to be in the level 1 space. Probably the DoD has told us between 60 and 80% they believe are going to be in the level 1 category. which means that this notion of process maturity won't even affect them hardly at all. Now, would it be a good thing if they documented and managed their processes at level 1? Of course it would be. It would be a great thing if they would do that for just the 17 practices that are in level 1. But the assessor won't assess whether they've done that or not for a level 1 only assessment. That's kind of an important thought, that there's a difference between what an assessor assesses and how you use the model to improve your own organization. You could easily adopt level 3 practices, but only be assessed at level 1. So those are the assessment method and the model itself are two different things.
Yeah, and it sounds like the CMMC is really looking at meaningful contextual use of information for the assessment. So we've all been feeling the tug and pull of the expanding ecosystem based on what we've been going through in 2020. And I think what's great about this is it's basically saying you're required, as what you're providing as a service contextually or a product or a software, that you're either level 1 or level 3 or level 5 or whatever it ends up being, and that's what you're going to be assessed on. So it really puts a wrapper around exactly what they need to get ready for and prepped for.
It does. Yeah. And I think the DoD's done a great job of positioning this as a true framework for protecting the nation, and as opposed to, another plaque on the wall. I call that plaque buildup, when a company has 80 plaques on the wall for every certification they have, but for some reason they can't figure out how to create a plan. I think they've done a really good job here of creating a framework that's going to really encourage organizations to use this as an improvement model, which is exactly what it's for. So I want to talk for a minute about deployment and implementation. Like how are they going to roll this out? Because it isn't magic. You can't just put a bunch of CISAs out in the field and say, go do this, right? Because you can't scale it and you can't have consistency. And there's been plenty of people that have told me that and said, why can't we just hire only CISAs or other kinds of certified individuals and just say, go off and assess? And the answer is scale. So there's going to be, a couple of 100,000 up to 300,000 companies going through this process. We're going to have 2,000 to 3,000 assessors. We have to have standards and process, and it has to be organized, or else it'll just, devolve into chaos. So the accreditation body was established in, about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, as a means to manage this process, and started out as a group of volunteers, and the group is starting to get some staff on now finally. So there's a lot of work done. And I think about 10,000 hours of work has gone into this on a volunteer basis to pull this together. Creating training and testing. We've already trained over 100 provisional assessors, licensing training organizations to take that over from us. We're licensing C3PAOs, the certified, the Cmmc third-party assessment organizations, and there's a consulting piece to this called the registered practitioners. So all of this was kind of developed as a way to start to feed that machine and start to build up capability in the field. And this accreditation body was the vehicle for doing that. Now, at some point, it'll be a full corporation with employees, and then there'll be a training organization that's kind of separate from it. And then there'll be licensed training providers, and then there'll be all this stuff in the ecosystem is just starting to kind of, flourish, I guess. And over the next, few months, we're going to see a lot of action in this space. So, the accreditation body is kind of a loose affiliation right now of 12 business owners and professionals that have volunteered their time to put all this stuff together. It is a corporation, and we are starting to hire staff, but we're board members, we're not staff. So it's just been a really interesting journey so far to pull all this together.
Well, I think that when you start accreditations like that, you as board members really have to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty until you can start getting all of
Yeah.
the other people ready and available to help out. So probably ready for a rest.
Yeah, it's really been crazy. I think I've had probably since COVID, especially, because one thing COVID did was keep me off an airplane and sit me at my desk for 12 hours a day, and we really couldn't have done this if it weren't for COVID, which is really just an ironic, weird thought. Like, if it weren't for this horrible thing we're all living through, we never could have made this thing go live. And it's just true, because we're able to, we do meetings at 9, 10 at night on Saturdays, early in the morning, because everybody has jobs. Everybody has, I run a company, other folks do. So it's just really been interesting to go through this process of building this ecosystem to serve this 300,000, company sized, you know, I don't know, I was going to say monster. I don't know if that's a good word for it, but it's just this huge,
Yeah.
it's a huge, large ocean. And, we couldn't just say, hey, assessors, go do this. We had to build a pipeline. So that's what our registered practitioners are about. We had to have like starting level, middle level, high performing level, evolutionary licensing for people. We had to have training. We had to have a way to do QA, a way to handle disagreements in the outcome of assessments, licensing agreements, code of professional conduct. There's just literally hundreds of things, systems that had to be put up, everything from a help desk to registration systems to reviews. And, it's really amazing the amount of work that's been done by some volunteers. I think there's probably people in the market that wish we had full-time staff so they wouldn't have to wait for things as long as they've had to. And I appreciate that frustration and their patience. But we do have staff. We have some staff members now, and things are really starting to accelerate. So it's just a super exciting time.
Good. Yeah, it takes an army to build something like this, and you're kind of looking at. I remember back in the day when New York DFS and then GDPR and then CCPA, when it comes forward to you, and you're thinking about how am I going to meet all of these regulatory requirements, or how am I going to get a certification, or how am I going to stay relevant? And it sounds like you've done a lot of the parts and pieces and set things up for success. So all of this pre-planning that you've been doing for the past umpteen months while in COVID has done you service for sure.
Yeah, and we haven't done it alone. I mean, the DoD has sponsored multiple working groups that have contributed a great deal. We have partners at Hopkins APL, Applied Physics Lab, and the SEI that have been participating in mock assessments and have been providing content. And, there's a whole working group for reciprocity across models. And, we're working on the sort of administrative operational piece, but there's other groups that are just doing amazing work and really helping out. So I think there's probably, a couple of hundred people working together on this project, and it's just coming together. It's taken a little while to sort of solidify, but it's really looking good now. I know we only have a couple more minutes, so I just want to spend a couple of minutes informing people of, the kinds of people or roles that they'll interact with as they go through the CMMC journey themselves from an OSC standpoint, organizational seeking certification standpoint. Right now we have 100 plus, about 102 provisional assessors completed their training and completed their exams. So as soon as the DoD opens the door for assessments for SCORE to occur, they'll be ready. We're also going to be, so you're likely, if you're a company that's having a CMMC assessment, you will likely interact with a provisional assessor. Now, a provisional assessor, you can think of that word provisional to mean pilot. They're the first cadre, first cohort, I guess is the word we're using, that are going to give us feedback for how well the process is working. They're going to, work closely with us to make sure that, the model and the process and the method and the appraisal assessment method and everything are all working, and then giving us feedback. We're also going to be training some provisional instructors, and these are people that are going to teach the incoming classes of certified assessors. Right now, the AB has been teaching these courses on top of everything else that we have going on. So that's going to be sort of a thing of the past once we get through this provisional instructor piece.
Well, that'll be good.
After that, we start training.
Oh, sorry. You said you had 100 people trained and you need what, 2,000? So that'll be good to have those.
By 2025, we'll need 2,000. Yeah. Well, we'll need as many instructors as possible because, like I said, and I'll talk about this in a second. We're distributing the training. We're actually signing a license agreement with training organizations to actually do the training. The AB is getting out of the training business. We're not going into the assessment business at all. We're only training now to get people off the ground. Once this formal program, once we're done the provisional period, go ahead, Brenda.
Well, I was going to ask a quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one of the things that I was thinking about is now that we're in the COVID situation, we're not really able to go on site. So how are you addressing the virtual nature of doing the training and then also doing the assessments? Maybe you can hit that before the end of the hour.
Yeah, sure. No, I can hit that now because we've been training people and talking about this. We have been involved in some, mock or pilot assessments that require that some of the organization's personnel need to be on site, where they've used cameras to show us things that we need to look at. And the DoD is constantly evaluating how COVID affects the assessment process, and do certain practices need to be waived or temporarily postponed because you can't see certain things. But at this point, the ones we've conducted with the use of cameras have worked out pretty well. Now, there's all kinds of, minefields in there with cameras and secure locations and things like that. But, we will cross that bridge when we come to it, I guess.
Yeah. When I was at Edwards Air Force,
but we are going to...
There were black box items where I could not go into certain rooms because the scientists had things that I wasn't able to see. So I can completely understand how you might be blocked from certain things unless you're black box certified or something to that effect.
We definitely will be, and we see this in the CMMI world too, where I have to have a certain level of clearance to just conduct an assessment myself. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I don't have that. And then I can't do it. I got to get somebody else to do it, or they have to find someone else. And we're going to run into that as well. I mean, the on-site requirements for assessors aren't going to be any different than any other consultant or employee. If you need a clearance, if you need a background check, if you need to be a U.S. citizen, all those things are still going to apply just for you to get in the building. Our job is to train you and test you, and to do a background check, which I'll talk about in a second. So we are going to start the formal training program for certified assessors at the end of Q1 in 2021. So that's the current plan. There will be external training organizations offering what we're calling the certified professional training, which is kind of entry level to becoming an assessor or an instructor, or what we're calling a master instructor, which is the people who teach the teachers, or to be a quality auditor as part of the AB process. So these are the individual certifications that we're offering and that are currently in flight, and starting to gather all of the materials and requirements for all of these. In a non-certified role, we have consultants that we're calling registered practitioners. Now, these are people that aren't certified, aren't going to do assessments, but they want to be part of the ecosystem. They want to get some training. They want to be listed on the marketplace. They want to offer services as part of the ecosystem. That's not saying that the AB wants to monopolize the consulting business, because that's not our goal at all. It's just a question of pipeline that we've been talking about. We're trying to get entry-level people into this so that they can eventually become certified assessors themselves. And they can work for some organization like a third-party assessment organization. Those are the folks that manage the assessment process. Or they can provide training as a company, or they can publish training, or maybe even work inside of an organization that's going to be assessed. And that this is all part of our ecosystem. And we've also got an organizational registration for consulting firms that want to be, recognized, take training, be part of the ecosystem, but not necessarily deliver assessments or not deliver assessments at all. We call that an RPO. So I just wanted to kind of give you the framework of all of the, the depth of what this ecosystem looks like. There's a lot there, but the big takeaway is there is an evolutionary path from registered practitioner to certified professional to certified assessor to certified instructor to certified master instructor. So there's an evolutionary career path for people wanting to get into the industry and be part of this ecosystem. And that was one of the requirements from Katie, was that we wanted to take people, especially active duty folks, who maybe didn't have enough experience to be certified assessors, but we needed to build an evolutionary path for them to become certified assessors. So that's been a big part of our focus is that pipeline, along with the 300,000 scalability question, as well as maintaining independence and all these things. So there's a lot of different requirements all kind of happening at once, and we're not, we haven't mastered all of them yet, but we're working pretty hard. So I was just going to end with this. This is the kind of the process that an organization will go through to become assessed. They're going to learn from their contracting officer, what level is required based on whether they use, whether they touch CUI or not, is primarily the differentiator between levels. And there's, of course, a period of implementation where maybe there's certain things they're not doing that they need to start doing. There's some self-assessment in there, and then they'll start the assessment cycle where they'll hire a C3PAO and there'll be an assessment performed, and then that report will get submitted to the DoD. So for the first year or so, the DoD has told us that they will be picking contracts to be part of this process. And they've used the number 15. I don't know exactly how many it will be, but there's a limited number. So 15 contracts with all the subs, we think is between 500 and 800 companies probably total, with all the bidders and all the subs. So that's the target for the initial rollout. Once we get to 2026, though, we expect to have 265,000 plus companies in that mix, and of course by that time there'll be renewals happening, right? So it's going to be a really big challenge, and like I said, the biggest and fastest implementation of something like this in recorded history that I know of. So it's been keeping us busy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're here to help enable that scalability. So with everything that you're talking about, when we think about third-party risk or doing assessments in general, our platform isn't going to be something that makes you accredited. Our platform is something that enables you to get the information all collected together for the C3PAOs or for the accredited resources that will need to see that information in order to give you your certification. So we're here to help companies that want to be in those positions to do assessments. And then we're also here to help those companies that need to be assessed so that they can fill out the information proactively and then make it so that the scalability can move faster, since this engine is going to be growing so quickly and rapidly. We have automated and accelerated third-party workflows. So as Jeff has been talking about the process flow, we make it faster to identify if there are risks. We make sure the manual labor is removed wherever possible. And then we give reports based on what's required from the DoD and the Cmmc requirements. So if you switch to the next slide, that kind of just shows the maturity level that we abide by, which fits very nicely into your maturity model as well. We do have a make smarter decisions section in there and a get out of spreadsheet jail area, but we want to make it so that if you're having to use an Excel spreadsheet, It's more secure if you use a secure platform. You don't send the information over the line or the web or email. And then making sure that we're taking that information into a dynamic position and an agile approach like you talked about, Jeff, so that if you've got things that are identified as vulnerabilities, you can start working on those quite rapidly, even before you get an accredited resource to do your certification, and track those in your 3-year contract to make sure that you're making those stay stable, because it's not just about getting a certification and putting it on your beautiful shelf behind you, Jeff. It's you get a certification and you keep that thorough throughout your time of the 3 years that certification is supposed to stand true. On the next slide, this basically starts going into all the many intelligence areas from every corner. We talk really heavily about cybersecurity, and that is something that's important, but there's also other documentation or products or services that's impacting the supply chain, whether you can get the product to where it needs to be in order to build what you need to build or deliver things that need to be delivered. So we have everything from helping you with understanding cybersecurity from the hacker space of outside in versus the information that you're gathering with the intelligence that CMMC is contextually asking you from a just do it to a very mature area. And then finally, on the last slide, I believe that's for prevalent, we are very, very happy and excited that the quadrant for Gartner has put us in a leadership position, especially for product and service, product strategy, and industry strategy, which is agnostic across the whole. Got a little tongue-tied there, but we really stand tall against making sure that we're listening to what's needed from a CMMC approach or from an assessor approach to make sure that we're giving people the enablement solutions to do what they need to do faster, quicker, smarter, and accurate. So if we go into the next slide, I think that goes into our Q&A, and Amanda will pop on.
Amanda's back.
I'm back. Yes, we definitely have questions, and I'm also going to pull up that poll question I talked about earlier, and let me launch it right now. And that is, are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the next several months? Please answer honestly. I will be the one more than likely following up. So if you want to hear from me, say yes, and we'll chat. Make sure to answer honestly. So a couple of Q&As here. The first one was the NIST CSF define implementation tiers, in parentheses, not a CMM. Is this in conflict to the CMMC model? What might be the pros and cons for each?
Well, I don't think it's in conflict with it. I don't. Brenda, do you guys have a position on whether it's in conflict?
No, I wouldn't think that it's in conflict. I would think it's complementary, and you would just need to make sure that you're looking at the CMMC model and those other types of requirements and gauging what's reflected. There's also ways that you can take the CMMC context of level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 and make sure that you're mapping the right maturity items to those collected content areas. Then you can see the deltas if there are any deviations. But I believe, Jeff, you can correct me if my perception is wrong, but I believe that as you were building this as a community, you were taking into effect the different levels, and we could probably help them with identifying those with the prevalent platform, especially because we can identify those risks that would say, here's where you're meeting a compliance perspective of a framework versus a methodology versus CMMC contextual requirements.
Right.
Another question is, for certifications, will credit be given for other certifications such as ISACA or IAA or CSA, CRISC, etc.?
Yeah, it sounds those are all cybersecurity personal certifications, and the CMMC training is not about cyber. So I get this question. I actually did a webinar earlier today, and someone asked me the same question. I get it a lot.
They're following you.
Yeah, right. Well, those things definitely play into the prerequisites for being accepted into the program to begin with, right? So there are prerequisites related to experience, and certifications are part of that. So that we use to evaluate. So in that sense, yes. However, there won't be a direct correlation or direct reciprocity, because the CMMC training and examination process isn't about cyber. It's mostly about interpreting the model itself and about the assessment method and the assessment framework and the assessment guide. So we want our assessors to really understand the common interpretations of the practices, want them to understand the process for conducting assessments, creating findings, submitting findings, dealing with disputes and adjudication. And those things are outside the scope of CISA or any of the other certifications. So while it's part of the prerequisite evaluation, there's not a reciprocity between the two.
Okay. All right, next question. What organizations will be obligated to conform to CMMC accreditation under the new laws mentioned? Oh, there's two questions in this question. Should I tell
you? Well,
let
me answer the first part. Is the DoD controls who needs to be certified. So that's the word they're using, certification. The DoD controls that, and they will be putting it into contracts. So in 2021, calendar year 2021, they've said they're picking 10 to 15 contracts that will include all of the primes and subs who bid on the contracts. So they will control that. And so then they'll eventually start releasing more contracts with the CMMC requirement in them. So if you do business with the DoD, you will eventually be subject to a CMMC assessment. Now, it may not be this year. It may be, in 2 years. We just don't know. If it's this year, it's because you're involved in one of those 10 to 15 contracts. So right now, we don't know who those companies are going to be.
The second part of that was, does CMMC accredit vendors providing an information security management system solution? Is there a value in the CMMC accreditation for non-DoD organizations?
If your organization is providing services to a DoD contractor, like if you're a CSP or an MSP, then yes, CMMC will eventually reach you, because if you're providing, data management services, for instance, or you're a CSP, cloud service provider, you will need to comply with the relevant practices in the CMMC. Now, if you're a tool provider, we are getting ready to release what we're calling our licensed software provider and LSP program, which is for companies that want to develop CMMC tools that interact with the CMMC ecosystem, like assessment related tools, for instance, reporting tools, measurement tools, things like that. So that'll be part of that. But those tools, of course, will need to comply with the relevant practices. But outside of that, I don't see the CMMC coming to your door quite yet.
Next question. Must I be employed by a company to be certified? I am a W-2 employee for various staffing agencies.
I'm going to assume that's to be an assessor or a registered practitioner, and the answer is no. You are free to conduct assessments with various C3PAOs as an independent contractor. You do not need to be an employee to do that. The only rule there on that subject is that you need to be, your contract needs to be managed and controlled by a licensed C3PAO.
All right, another question here. What does your international vision look like beyond the US DoD? Asking from the UK.
I'm thinking maybe going to Fiji and just laying out on the beach. That's my vision. But other than that, we have had numerous conversations with organizations in the UK and in Canada to talk about that process. And the DoD's currently is focusing only on, primarily on the US. They want to get the US started and get us under control, and then we'll expand out to different parts of the world. So it's not something that we're going to see, I don't think, this year or this coming year, but eventually we will be global.
All right, looks like we have time for one more question. That's all we have left. Is the older DoD DAWIA applicable in any way? Defense Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act circa 1990s. Oh my God, I had to come up for air for that.
I know. When I started working with I had never worked with the DoD before, and I always worked with contractors. And when I first started being on the AB, I had to have a guy make me like a cheat sheet with all the acronyms and all the, because I didn't know, I didn't know what any of these were. And so I'm not sure what that is, but the only, in terms of whether anything else is applicable, I think the purpose of the CMMC was to bring together all relevant models into one model. It's kind of like the one model to rule them all. And, of course, NIST 800-171 is the one where most of it came from, but they drew from, ISO 27001. They drew from a little bit from CMMI. So I don't know if they drew from that model or not. I don't have an answer to that.
Well, there you go. Well, it's fine because we ran out of time anyways. So
I'll still talk about it. I just don't have an answer.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And Brenda, as always, lovely to see your face.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Jeff.
And hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Thank you, Amanda.
Questions? Of course. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach us. You have our information. I'm on the chat on the website. So that's me, not a robot. And we'll help you. Well, have a great day, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.